You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldozed their villages, seized their property under laws they had no part in making.
And now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Anslow.
This is episode 356 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Of course, you all know Will Porter, who's the great writer. Right now, he's working at RT as a staff writer, putting out tons of great content every day. You can find it all on its Twitter page at WKPANCAP at RT.com. He also has posted articles, published articles at ConsortiumNews.com, Antiwar.com, and the Libertarian Insitute, which is where you find my show and my daily news roundup in the right-hand column of that page. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I mean, lately I've had you on about every week, which is fantastic because you're doing a bunch of great work over at RT. I mean, it's great having an ANCAP, putting out just some of the news reports that we're reading every day. And so what we're covering today is some stuff that you've covered and just stuff that we're both watching internationally. I think the biggest story we have today, or maybe even the most important here, is about Julian Assange's potentially declining health. So, Will, we know he's in this UK supermax prison for just violating bail terms, but go ahead and tell us about what his health conditions are, or alleged to be, of course, because it's not like, we're getting a whole lot of reporting. I think there's just statements from WikiLeaks, Assange's lawyer, and then we have a blog post from Karen Kotowski.
Yeah, so as you're kind of suggesting, there's not a whole lot of detail out about like the status of Julian Assange's health. However, what we do know is that his lawyer, his Swedish lawyer, is saying that he's in a state where he can't really carry on a normal conversation. And so whatever that means, because it's not clear whether he's he's suffering some kind of dental problem, because there's also been statements along the lines that he's not eating properly and he's lost a lot of weight. And so it's not clear to me whether that's being caused by dental problems or some kind of greater illness. You and I were just talking off air, like potentially what the effects could be of being confined in in the embassy for years and years, in terms of just like the lack of sunlight and the malnourishment, and even just in terms of like psychologically being so habituated to just a small little area. So there's a lot of like possibilities for what could be happening with Assange right now, but we do know that he's in the hospital ward of the Belmarsh prison, the British jail he's in. Now, I don't believe he's had any like real contact with the public. There's something we will get to in a second, but in terms of him reaching out to the public. But I don't think we have further details really on his health status right now.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it on the show today is because I think it's the beginning of a developing story, which is going to be how is Julian Assange treated in this UK jail, and then potentially wherever they ship him off to, whether that's the US or Sweden from there. Just because there's a lot of hostility and resentment towards him, and there's I think, gonna be maybe a tendency for them to kind of think that the solution to their problem is to have Assange die from, whatever natural causes they claim it to be, because he had like this ongoing injury and poor health and all that. And so I think there's a lot of concern there. And so there has to be pressure turned up to say, like, you absolutely make sure this guy does not die on your watch, because if so, we're going to, say that you killed him. It's all your fault. And, we're going to demand reforms and people step down and hold people accountable and stuff like that, rather than what could possibly happen, which is, he just either gets poor or even the average, medical treatment for prisoners, which I'm guessing isn't very great. I mean, the supermax prison that he's in, I believe, is where the UK sends their worst of their worst. So, he's all now in cells and around, I guess, prisoners, are murderers and rapists and crazy stuff like that.
Yeah. And now in terms of like what people are speculating about Assange's health problems, you did mention that article by Karen Kotowski, which is at LouRockwell.com. And this is sort of iffy to me. I do respect Karen Kotowski. She's an Iraq War, the second Iraq War whistleblower. She broke news about the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon, stirring up propaganda for war. So she is a very, I think, reliable person. But in this case, she is citing an unnamed source, but her unnamed source is saying that Assange is undergoing some kind of coercive interrogation from intelligence agencies or security services. I think she suggested that it was like American and British jointly doing this together, and also drugging Assange with a drug called BZ. But this stuff is all completely speculative, and I don't know like exactly. I would encourage grains of salt with that, but certainly I'm interested in learning more about on that angle.
Right. So it's certainly something that my audience should pay attention to as we look through the news in the coming days is, what is Assange's health status? Maybe we find out that U.S. interrogators have been to U.K. prisons. And even if it's not, maybe as vicious as Karen Kwiatkowski is painting right now where, they're drugging him or something like that, certainly, having somebody like Assange who's apparently in a solitary confinement situation, only 1 hour a day out of his cell, if there's, people yelling at him all day, telling him he's only going to be known as a rapist or something like that, that could really cause some psychological damage to a guy, especially a guy that, has been locked in just a single room in the Ecuadorian embassy for so many years.
Right. And let's remember, too, that Assange having health problems, this isn't a totally new claim or a new thing. I think even 2 years ago, while Assange was still in the Ecuadorian embassy, doctors did go and visit him and say that he was undergoing some pretty extreme problems. But even there, I think they were kind of vague about, I don't know, maybe it's sort of sensitive information. It's health problems and stuff. Maybe they're not going to publicize it too much. But I recall there was something about him having shoulder problems and stuff too. And so the point being that, Assange's health may have been deteriorating for quite some time before this.
Yeah. And the reason I kind of speculate that maybe this is a dental injury is I've heard he needed like a crown or a root canal leading up to this and that he's been unable to get that treatment. And I think this is something even the UN has brought up, that you can't deny him treatment from a doctor. He should have been able to go out and get oral surgery or, necessary accommodations be made, which, they were never allowed to happen. So, he's had to suffer with various injuries for several years. I think, in fact, that was one of the things he was hoping to do when it came to testifying in front of Congress in the U.S. about the Russiagate leaks, explaining that, it wasn't Russia behind that. He had said, I want this medical work I need done. And, that never materialized or happened. So, some guy, ongoing medical issues, it's a tough situation for Julian Assange. We really have to hope he's okay. We're not going to, I'm guessing, get a lot of transparency from the UK government unless the people there are absolutely demanding it. So that's really an important thing. One other thing I want to talk about here, and I'm going to link to this article in the show notes page by Jonathan Cook. It's at antiwar.com. And what it does is it goes through and gives a bullet point breakdown of the accusations of rape against Julian Assange and how that kind of term came to be and how that narrative was built and what the reality of it was. And so, he explains there that, the initial allegations were not even of rape. And when one of the girls was, offered a statement to sign saying that it, was a rape investigation, she refused to do so. What they had hoped to do is, I think, Assange tested for HIV. One of the girls, turned a condom over to the cops that didn't even have Assange's DNA on it. And so, there's a lot of holes in that whole plot there. So for those of you who want answers there, because I get it, that it could be kind of uncomfortable to defend somebody who's been accused of this and, having people say, well, you're, a defender of a rapist. Here is a quick, easy, bullet by bullet point breakdown, to kind of be able to refute that pretty comfortably. And so that'll be linked to in the show notes page. Well, there's one other thing I want to address on Julian Assange, and that's like a statement or a letter that Assange put out that you had transcribed. So why don't you go ahead and read that for us?
Yeah, sure. So this is a couple days ago. I don't believe the letter was sent a couple days ago. I believe it was publicized a couple days ago. I think it was actually sent to this British journalist, Gordon Dimmock, pretty soon after Assange was jailed in April. And so the text of the letter reads like this, quote, "I am unbroken, albeit literally surrounded by murderers, but the days where I could read and speak and organize to defend myself, my ideals, and my people are over until I am free. Everyone else must take my place. The U.S. government, or rather those regrettable elements in it that hate truth, liberty, and justice, want to cheat their way into my extradition and death, rather than letting the public hear the truth, for which I have won the highest awards in journalism and have been nominated 7 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Truth, ultimately, is all we have. JPA." end quote. And so that's the statement he put out. And I think that's like the most direct contact we've had with Julian Assange since he's been arrested.
Yeah, well, it's a good summary of what needs to happen too. From here, Will, I guess I want to talk about some stuff going on in France that, as we talked about this last time on the show and it happened again, really great activism going on with apparently another Saudi ship arriving at a French port and some protesters coming out and trying to stop weapons from being put on board. So I think you got all the details here, Will. Why don't you break it down?
Yeah, sure. So we have another case where these European activists are attacking the Saudi Arabia's war effort in Yemen by interfering with their ability to load cargo on their ships at ports in Europe. And so previously you had activists doing this in France and in Italy and in Spain, just in the past couple weeks, just this month. So in Italy, you actually had dock workers literally refusing to load equipment onto these Saudi ships. I think it was generators that were somehow used in the war effort. Whereas in France and Spain, I think it was more of just an activist protest effort. However, in the earlier French case, which happened in mid-May, they successfully actually filed a legal challenge, and the Saudi ship left the port without the stuff, without the they were supposed to load these Caesar howitzer artillery cannons, which are knock-mounted artillery systems that are made by France. And so this week, this same French activist group called Christians for the Abolition of Torture, or known as ACAT by their French acronym, they tried this again at a different port with a different Saudi ship, and they filed a legal challenge trying to prevent ammunition for those same howitzer cannons from being loaded onto the ship. The Saudis had already bought a ton of these howitzers a while ago. Even though the earlier shipment was prevented, they still have them. However, though, it appears that ACAT has now prevented this ammunition from being loaded. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly one of the more optimistic things I've seen in the Yemen war front in a while. So I think that's good.
Yeah, well, it's, become clear at this point that the leadership of countries really don't care about morality or anything, even as basic as, trying to feed a starving baby. And so finally, it seems that enough people know about this war, and it's just so horrific, I guess, that, they have to do something about it. I mean, I think that's probably, I know for myself, and I'm sure you'll agree, part of the reason that, why we're motivated to spend so much time, reading and learning about this kind of stuff is because what's going on in Yemen is just so horrific and so unnecessary that anybody who learns about it can't really sit still on it. So, yeah, I mean, this seems like great activism to me. Hopefully it could spread and catch on. I'm guessing as it grows, there's going to be, kind of growing resistance from the state and trying to, manipulate ways to stop it, change laws, load ships at different ports or something like that. But it's a great thing, and it's a great start. We also have Congress making an effort. And I forgot to mention this to you before the show, so I'll go ahead and talk mostly about this one here. But Congress is apparently looking at a couple different paths to blocking Trump's arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE. 22 sales in all. We're only discovering what some of those are for now. I think F-15 engines and some launchers and munitions and stuff like that. That Congress had previously either refused to sell to Saudi Arabia, or the Trump administration didn't approve it because they knew that Congress would reject it if they chose to, specifically these what they call offensive weapons that were being sold to Saudi Arabia. So now I guess Congress is looking to kind of do a vote to override this. The number 2 in the House, the Democrat there, is all on board with it. And I think some of the leaders of the key Democratic committees in the House are also on board. And then you also have an effort by Rouhani to try to convince Nancy Pelosi to sue Donald Trump in the Supreme Court for what he did with the Yemen War Powers veto, by vetoing a Yemen War Powers bill, which doesn't seem to me that could be something that would be allowed. I mean, I think even Nancy Pelosi understands the Constitution well enough to go in front of the Supreme Court and say, now, is anywhere in here a law that says the president could start any war he wants, and unless 2/3 majority in each house vote to oppose it, that's the president's powers to wage that war? I think even the most liberal of judges would laugh her out of the room. And, this doesn't include the constitutionalists like Thomas and Gorsuch and others. So it seems to me that like if they were to make that argument, it would be pretty hard to beat.
Yeah. I mean, there's several, I think, like legal challenges you could pose to assisting the Saudi war effort. Like, there's all kinds of domestic legislation already on the books about how you can't send weapons to war criminals and stuff. And there's also international law that's along those lines. Like the French activists, their whole legal argument is actually on the basis of like they argue that France signed this UN arms trade treaty. And in doing so, it agreed to not ship weapons to violators of human rights or people committing genocide or war crimes. And so they're arguing that, hey, France agreed to this thing, and so let's hold them to it. And so, there's all kinds of tricky stuff with international law, especially with the U.S. They totally reject, in many cases, international law being applied to them. But I think there should be, several existing like legal routes to challenge this.
Last thing I'll mention here is we have like real twisted kind of policy coming out, especially like from people like Lindsey Graham, who on Saudi weapon sales said, I reject President Trump selling Saudi Arabia weapons, but I think he's doing a good job sending more U.S. forces to the Middle East to counter Iran, which is really crazy that, you stand against the Saudi state and you're saying, I don't trust the Saudi state with these weapons, but then you're going to send American troops to go defend the Saudi state. It's absolute insanity.
Yeah, that reminds me, just on like the same day this French activist group filed this legal challenge, a French official, I think it was the foreign minister, but came out and basically like slammed the Saudi war effort, called it a dirty war, but then defended French weapon sales to Saudi and said like, no, well, we're keeping a real close eye on that. Like, we shouldn't stop doing that. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's crazy. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth here.
Right. It doesn't make any sense because all the weapons the U.S., the U.K., and France and all these other European countries sell Saudi Arabia, according to all the Western countries, only go towards countering Iran. But they've never bombed Iran, and they're constantly bombing Yemen. So explain that to me. I mean, there's a real gap in logic there, but they know that nobody in the media really asks those questions, and they're never going to make a big enough deal about it to make the people understand. I mean, we talk about MSNBC now running a single story on Yemen over the course of like 3 or 6 months or something crazy like that. But the truth is that they would need to run several stories on the, country before people would start to sink in. Oh, this is Yemen. This is where it is. This is who the Houthis are. This is who Hadi is. This is what the Americans are doing. This is what side we're on. And there's no basis of that knowledge in the public whatsoever. Even a matter of like the fact that we're supporting the Saudi war in Yemen, I think is still relatively unknown. It's certainly more well known now than when me and you first started talking about it on the show 2 years ago. And we're saying, oh my God, there's a genocide going on. Why won't somebody do something to stop it? Why don't people care? And I mean, we've certainly, made some ground since then, Will. I mean, back then we were lucky to get like 17 senators opposing a Saudi shipment of weapons to, a sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And now, we could actually block the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, the main support for the war goes on and the genocide continues. It's just horrific.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the media, I mean, just look at how they hammer on other narratives. Look at how they hammer on the Russia narrative or talking about Iran. Like, they know that repetition is how you kind of get get people to understand something. You have to kind of explain it over and over again, day in and day out. And so just, devoting like a token story to Yemen every once in a while, I don't know. It's like you're saying, it's not really going to make the impact that we want to see. Although I think you are right that we are making some inroads here and that it does seem like this is becoming more of like, people are considering this like a moral issue. It's something that's important and that you should pay attention to.
Right. I mean, just imagine if we had paid enough attention to Yemen as, people did to the like Kofefe tweet or any stupid thing that Trump has said that's not really political. Like I get maybe spending a little bit more time on some of the things he says that are like hawkish or offensive to people. But I'm just talking about the things that people are just mocking him for. Like when he does or says something stupid. I mean, in fact, what we really need him to do is spell Yemen wrong in a tweet. To tweet out something about Yemen and spell it wrong, because then, Rachel Maddow will run with it 24/7 for a week. But I guess we should move on to Turkey here, Will, because we got a lot to cover today. I mean, Turkey is a really key country in the world, and doesn't get a lot of attention. I mean, it's a large country. It's the second largest army in NATO. I believe it's the only NATO country outside of Europe or North America, with most of it being in Asia. It's, I think considered a Middle Eastern country. It's a Muslim country. It's considered to be the largest Muslim democracy in the world. And there's a lot that goes on there. And it's a real important country. And the U.S. has some nuclear weapons there. But there's been a lot of incidents in recent years. And I think over the course of the show, me and Will have really covered this idea that the position the U.S. is taking in Syria is in opposition to Turkey. But there's also this weapon sale that Turkey's looking to acquire the S-400 missile system from Russia. And Turkey is also involved not only as a buyer of the F-35, the new 5th generation stealth aircraft that the U.S. is buying, but also a part of the supply chain for that project. So, Will, I'll let you go over some of the recent details we have here.
Yeah, sure. So just sort of to summarize what you said there, the U.S. basically says to Turkey that if they go through with purchasing the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, which is supposed to be, I think that's supposed to happen over the summer in July or something, when those shipments are actually supposed to happen. Although the agreements for those happened, I think, in like 2017. And so it's kind of been long in the making that they've been supposed to buy these S-400s, but they haven't yet. But the U.S., though, says that if Turkey goes through with that, they will not sell them the F-35. And they argue that if Turkey gets the S-400, that this isn't compatible or interoperable with like NATO defense infrastructure. And but I think it's less of like a technical thing. I don't think there's a technical limitation between hooking up the S-400 into other defensive infrastructure. I think it's like a political concern that they don't want Russia to be linked into that or Russian equipment to be linked into that. And so most recently, the U.S. actually just threatened to stop training the Turkish pilots to fly the F-35 that it's training in the U.S. And so they're saying if you go through with this purchase of this missile defense system, that we're no longer going to train your guys to fly our planes. Also this week, the manufacturer of the F-35, Lockheed Martin, they also right around the same time the U.S. made this threat, they came out and basically said they would not be too bothered if Turkey decides to buy the S-400. And they're saying they can get other countries to like fill the production slots that are currently reserved for Turkey, because Turkey currently has like its name on a certain number of models and production slots. And Lockheed's saying, it wouldn't matter to us too much if Turkey decided to go through with the S-400 because we'll sell them to other countries. I think they said like Japan or Poland or something wants a couple. Now, there's another thing, too, that happened this week, and I'm not totally sure if it is related to the S-400 or the F-35 or that whole, controversy. However, on, I think it was Wednesday, you had Turkey freeing a detained American citizen, a joint Turkish-American citizen. But this was a NASA scientist who worked in Houston, Texas, but he came to Turkey to visit family in 2016, and he was swept up in Turkey's, crazy political purge that happened after there was a coup attempt in 2016 that failed. And a lot of people, I think, are suspicious that maybe it was sort of like a false flag coup that they did just to consolidate, Erdogan did to consolidate power. However, Erdogan blames that coup on this guy named Fethullah Gulen, and who's a cleric who lives in the United States in Pennsylvania, I think. And the U.S. says that, the Turkish government says that Gulen's a terrorist and that this NASA scientist was somehow spying on behalf of Gulen's organization. And that's probably not true at all. It was pretty much like a kangaroo court that he was tried in. But Turkey has now decided to free that guy, sort of abruptly. And again, I'm not totally sure if it is related to the negotiations over the F-35 and the S-400, because you also had two senators introducing legislation a month ago that threatened Turkey with sanctions if they didn't free detained Americans that are in Turkish jails. And so maybe it was more related to that. I'm not totally sure, but still, I think this could be relevant, this freeing of the scientist.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting story. And then there's also, there's a former American pastor. I believe he was a pastor, some kind of clergy, who was in the Turkish jail for a couple of years, also related to the 2016 coup. I did want to mention that this week I read Poland announced they are looking to buy 32 F-35s. And so that could be a part of the, make up a sale there. And that there's also either Poland is a part of 5 or there's 5 other countries plus you're in Poland in Eastern Europe that are looking to acquire the F-35. So this could also be some of the sales looking to make up for Turkey. There would be, I guess, some strategic issues with trying to, replace Turkey in the supply chain since they make parts for the cockpit and maybe the landing gear. I've read. And the other thing I'll mention is I think there is some legitimate strategic concern to Turkey having both the S-400 missile system and the F-35 because of the S-400's radar getting data on the F-35 and its stealth capabilities.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that's the concern more so than like, oh, it just wouldn't work with the defense NATO, like, or the NATO defense infrastructure. Like, they're more concerned that, oh, Russia's going to somehow like have a backdoor access to that data or something. And yeah, you are right that Andrew Brunson or something, I forget the guy's last name. He was a pastor, and that guy was freed in October. All
right, now I want to move into Turkey's drone program. Yeah, Turkey has a drone program, and it's now an armed drone program. The article we have here that we read is very interesting. It's from the Intercept. It's kind of a long piece, but if you got the time, I mean, I think it's worth sitting down reading. I found it like super fascinating, going through and hearing how Turkey developed their drone program. So I guess I know Will has a lot of the details down here, so I'll go ahead and just let him explain how Turkey's drone program developed here.
Well, as you said, the Intercept story is actually very long and detailed. I actually can't recount all the whole story of like this guy, Selçuk Bayraktar, who's this MIT grad who, you know, came to America from Turkey to study and then went back to his home country and developed basically like from grassroots, from nothing, Turkey's drone program. And Turkey now has like armed drones, like serious armed drones, not like the kind the Houthi have, like that are kind of, you know, homemade or something. Like they have real like military grade drones that can, you know, shoot rockets at stuff. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating story though, just how this one guy basically, you know, came back to his home country, married the president's daughter, Erdogan's daughter, married her and basically, yeah, founded their drone program from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's still quite a young man. He graduated MIT here at 26 and then went back to Turkey. And I guess what he was doing at MIT was like figuring out how to like land helicopters in like vertical conditions and like when it's windy and just crazy stuff, you know. However, like they could figure out the AI and everything for that is quite unbelievable. But he goes back to Turkey and I think really convinces the country through like his own ambition, or not the country, at least the leadership of the country, through his own ambition, to, you know, develop this drone program and give him funding for it. And that's what he's been able to do. I think Will makes a very important distinction there as well, that you have like kind of two classes of armed drones. One is something that most countries could slap together. And that's something like, you know, they put some kind of guidance system on a drone and load it up with, you know, explosives, and then that thing goes and explodes somewhere. I'm not sure how that's all that much different from like a missile, or some kind of rocket, but you know, they call it a drone maybe because it has wings on it. But, you know, so that's what the Houthis use against Saudi Arabia. But what we're talking about here is like something like the Reaper or the Predator that's able to hover for hours. I mean, some of these things I think have like several days worth of flight time and are able to just hover and drop drone strikes. Now, where this gets really interesting isn't necessarily that Turkey just has the drones, because as we'll talk about, I think China and Iran are both able to produce armed drones as well. But here you have a situation where Turkey is really using them in crazy ways. And in the article is labeled the second drone age. And Will, tell us what the second drone age is.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for like weapons technology, you have like ages of I don't know, stages of development or something. Like you have like the development stage where the first country founds the weapon, like a nuclear bomb, you know, the United States invents it. But then you have the second stage, which is the proliferation stage, where other countries begin independently developing these weapons themselves, like not relying on transfers from the original country who developed it, but actually like, you know, putting their own scientists on it and developing their own thing. And so one of the points that this Intercept piece makes is that this is now the age of proliferation for drones, where other countries are now developing their own sort of like homegrown drone programs. Excuse me for rhyming. And yeah, it's just interesting to see how the technology spreads around the world. And like, you know, maybe someday we'll be like, I think you were saying off air, like we may be seeing, you know, dogfights between drones between China and Turkey or something. Who knows?
Right. Well, some of the interesting stuff here isn't necessarily just that, Turkey is using these armed drones, but how frequently they are, and including hovering over their own population. I think I read here they're doing about 6,000 hours of flight time a month. This is between surveillance and armed drones. And I think this is like over not only the Kurdish areas of Turkey, but also the Kurdish areas of Syria where Turkey is able to operate. So I guess this would be Afrin in North Aleppo, and then also in northern Iraq. And we'll talk more later about how Turkey has started its own military operation there. In total, I think they've killed about 1,200 people with these drones, or at least that's what's been able to be documented, including some civilians. While Turkey may deny this, it seemed to me that article was able to document at least 2 cases where civilians were killed in Turkey. And so it may have seemed ridiculous in 2013 when Rand Paul was up there filibustering. I believe that was the nomination of John Brennan, right, as CIA director, over the use of drones in the United States. But here we now have a country using armed surveillance and, with guided munition drones hovering above its own civilian population all day long.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a sort of known thing that Turkey's had some kind of armed presence in the south, to combat the Kurdish, the Kurdish population there. Because the Turkish government considers this group called the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's sort of this left-wing guerrilla organization that used to, I think, be more like straight up communist, whereas now it's some weird obscure anarchist sect. But Turkey nonetheless considers the PKK to be a terrorist organization, and so they've kind of fought on and off with them for years, since I think the 90s. But what I was not aware of was that drones were sort of like an essential element of that presence there in the south, and that they're flying these things 24/7, basically, it seems, given the hours, spying on people and in some cases killing them. And I think the Intercept story, I think it said 400 people had been documented killed inside of Turkey, in this whole effort against the Kurds. I'm not sure what time period that was in, but still, many people, some of them might actually be militants, but many people have been killed, I guess, in this domestic drone presence.
So, yeah, one of the things you point out there, Will, is proliferation. And, I know Turkey, has their own armed drone program. That's really what the article focused on. But we could also look that the UAE is now buying armed drones from China, and they even used one of those armed drones in an attack in Yemen against a political leader of the Houthis. So this isn't, the brother of al-Houthi, who's the, leader of the Houthi militant group, but, the guy who's the quote-unquote president, civilian president of the country, who was, assassinated with an armed drone by the UAE. I've also read that General Haftar potentially has drones from Iran that went through Sudan. So, more and more, kind of thugs around the world are getting their hands on drones, surveillance, and armed. And, like I said, not just the type that are able to, kind of be a guided missile and go on direct course and blow something up like the Houthis are doing. And this should be a real concern.
Yeah. And maybe you mentioned this. It might have gone in one ear and out the other. But Israel as well has a real drone presence over the Golan Heights. And I think Iran too is sort of has its own drone program in Syria, active. Because I know that the Israelis have accused Iran of flying drones over their border. And I think even just recently there was some clash that was related to Israel flying drones in that area. So I think that's interesting too, that drones are making their way into Syria and stuff as well.
I guess one of the unfortunate things when I look right now and kind of think that, we're really struggling just to maintain the kind of weapons agreements that we have globally, the NPT and stuff like that, potentially, redoing or extending the New START treaty. But, we've abandoned the INF treaty. More countries are getting nuclear weapons and making upgrades to them like India and Pakistan, that I really don't see any desire whatsoever to look at, look at new worldwide arms treaties on things like armed drones or, space weapons or anything like that. So this could really get out of hand. Next, I want to move on to Turkey's operations in northern Iraq. This seems somewhat, important because from what I understand, Iraq has not invited, Turkey in and has asked Turkey to leave. although I don't think really possesses the ability or the will to do, make them leave. But they're now carrying out operations against what they call PKK militants, as Will said before. The Turkish state considers them terrorists in northern Iraq, and this has included putting boots on the ground. So, well, I'm not sure if you have much else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it seems Turkey kind of gets very bold with northern Iraq. Like, I think there was even one point where they were threatening to annex Mosul or something, or part of or some northern Iraqi city. They sort of hark back to their Ottoman Empire roots there, where they think they can sort of just boss them around. Because they do kind of act. They think they can act with impunity in northern Iraq here. They're just sending in soldiers to I guess combat the PKK, so they say. It is part of Iraqi Kurdistan. And so I guess they just kind of treat Syrian, Turkish, and Iraqi Kurdistan all as an active war zone that they're allowed to, put boots or drones or do whatever they want, it seems. They get very assertive with these areas.
Yeah, well, maybe this is one of the problems with having Turkey in NATO. Being a NATO member really creates a situation where it makes it hard for anybody to do anything against Turkey, knowing that, the bad stop of the U.S. is there. And like I said, there's, nukes in Turkey and stuff like that, which make it a pretty important NATO ally. And that's why, when, crazy people start floating ideas like bringing Brazil and Colombia into NATO, we should absolutely say no, because there's, little disputes within these countries in South America. And we don't want to start picking sides if, Colombia, or Brazil start to, get in a war with Venezuela or anything crazy like that. Last thing I had here today, Will, is that, as we said, Turkey does bold things. And this time there's a small portion, or not a small portion, but a province of Syria. I think there's 1 million or so people there. The Idlib province that's still held by the al-Nusra front type rebels, which are, Al-Qaeda linked guys, and Turkey continues their support for them. So let us know what that support is.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Turkey has sort of had this ongoing relationship with the rebels in Syria, especially in the Idlib province, sort of where they have their last remaining stronghold, where sort of Bashar al-Assad and the Russians have kind of consolidated the remainder of the rebels in that province. And so, currently, the Syrians and Russians are launching assaults on the Idlib province to try to take back this last little pocket of rebel-held territory. And Turkey is continuing to aid those remaining rebel pockets. So I think it was last weekend, actually, Turkey delivered weapons to some of these rebels. That shipment included apparently at least dozens of armored vehicles, Grad rocket launchers, anti-tank guided missiles, and also tow missiles to these rebels. And under the American program to arm rebels, we also handed out a bunch of these shoulder-fired tow missiles, which the rebels used to great effect against Syrian tanks and armor and stuff. And really, that was a large reason why Russia got involved in the Syrian conflict in the first place, is because all these Syrian rebels with these American weapons were making gains up into the north, and the Russians responded to that. And so it's interesting, Turkey is now apparently providing some similar weaponry to these rebels still, even at this extremely late stage in the conflict.
And these are some particularly, I think, dangerous weapons. We've seen the tow missiles take out not only Syrian tanks, but Russian helicopters. And the armored vehicles can be packed up with explosives and then driven into fortified Syrian positions. I mean, we've seen this as a common tactic of ISIS. They pack these armored vehicles up with tons of explosives and drive them into the front gates of barracks. It's insane. It's disgusting, but that's what happens when you give these terrible people these weapons. And it's, I think, clear, Will, from, as closely as me, you have observed this, that the al-Nusra Front is the dominant political force in this region. And there's all kind of foreign jihadist types there. I think including, I read recently, 400 French forces and thousands of Uyghurs, Chinese Uyghurs that are living there.
Yeah. I think the Uyghurs too. I think they get I think they consider themselves some sect of Turkmens or something, and they have some kind of relation with Turkey, I believe. But yeah, it does sort of seem that I don't know, some of these external powers who've been helping the rebels are getting a little bit desperate as Syria and Russia and stuff close in on them in this small little remaining territory they have. And we talked about this the last time I was on the show, but I think this is particularly why people should be watching out for things like, chemical weapons allegations. It's like exactly at times like this where some important stuff's about to happen on the ground. An important gain is about to be, accomplished by the Assad military. And that's when you start hearing these chemical weapons allegations. So that's something else I would maybe, suggest your listeners watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to me to be playing out an awful lot like Aleppo and Douma, in the way that, we have all these protests from the Western countries about Assad being a butcher and doing terrible things, committing war crimes and stuff like that. And then at the same time, we're continuing, or at least us Western countries and NATO allies are continuing to supply weapons to the Al-Qaeda linked groups that Assad is fighting. So it's just a horrible thing all around, Will. But at least we got some good news in today with, the Saudi ships leaving the French ports without their weapons, maybe saving a few Yemeni lives in the process. Will, thanks so much for coming back on the show today. Tell people where to find your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back on anytime. Your audience can find me at rt.com. I'm a staff writer there. My stuff doesn't have bylines, but I do share it on my Twitter page, all the stuff that I write, which you can find at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. You can find my stuff, as you said at the beginning of the show, at the Libertarian Insitute, and at antiwar.com and Consortium News.
And make sure you take the time to share this show. That's why me and Will do it, so it gets out there to the listeners. Find the show at libertarianinstitute.org on the homepage.